What up, motherfuckers? It's your boy, the Hater. I recently started playing that Resident Evil 8, and I figured now's as good a time as any to drop another video game review on y'all motherfuckers, right? So thus far, the game that I reviewed The Last of Us, which I gave a solid, Last of Us 2, which I gave a shitty score. What was that, like a 6 or whatever I gave it? And then Cyberpunk, which, you know, basically gets a 0. It's called like it is. So I thought this would be a good opportunity to do a game that I knew I was gonna like. You know, obviously I haven't finished it yet. I started playing at midnight last night. But thus far, I'm a few hours in. I'm like 3 hours in or so. You know, it was fucking awesome, all right? Let's get to it, you know what I'm saying? Without any further ado, for those of you that don't know the Resident Evil series, there might be some light spoilers about past games. I don't know quite enough about this game to spoil it, and I'm not going to spoil the first 3 hours anyways. So basically, the Resident Evil games, motherfucks, date back all the way to the best decade, the 90s, right? And back in the day, these games were, in my opinion, relatively like standard thoroughfare horror games. Now, of course, for their times, they were revolutionary, right? Revolutionary. I was more of a Silent Hill guy, I still am, but nonetheless, I've always appreciated a good Resident Evil game. Resident Evil, the distinction that I make typically between Resident Evil and Silent Hill is that Resident Evil is a bit more action-based. Now, neither game is like a frantic action game until the later series, right? But Resident Evil, you typically play as like, you know, army people or cops or people that have some sort of training, right? Whereas in Silent Hill, you play as like a writer or like, you know, some husband, you know what I mean? Like, these aren't like badass types, right? They have to do what they have to do in order to survive. But in Resident Evil, you're usually playing as like highly trained specialists. Despite the fact that they're both survival horror, you don't feel as helpless in Resident Evil, you know? You could take down like a zombie in the earlier games, no problem, you know what I'm saying? No problem. Silent Hill, you feel a lot more helpless. In Silent Hill, I think the horror is much better. The stories are much better, and they're psychologically based and driven. So I think that's superior. But Resident Evil is more like action movie-ish, right? Now, here's where things get weird, motherfucks. By the time Resident Evil 4 came out, the game was basically an action game. Like, it was hardly a survival horror game, if we're being honest, right? Like, Resident Evil 4, there's bullets everywhere. You can buy shit from the merchant. You know what I mean? It's not like, you don't ever feel, except for the beginning of the game, where you have like a gun and like 7 bullets, you don't feel overwhelmed, right? Even if there's a lot of enemies, they're typically slow, you're typically faster, you have a shitload of bullets, you get a shitload of guns, and you're out there just blasting holes through people, you know what I'm saying? Eventually, no problem, right? You have the knife, that's another thing in Resident Evil. You always have like a weapon that you can fuck around with. In some Silent Hill games, your weapons break and you're fucked, right? So you have to run around picking shit up, motherfuckers. So, Resident Evil 7, which Resident Evil 8 obviously is like a direct sequel to, right? That thing changed the game a bit. Resident Evil 7, except for the fact that it's a first-person game versus the third-person standard of Resident Evil and Silent Hill, Resident Evil 7 changed the game. To me, Resident Evil 7 feels a lot more like a Silent Hill. For 2 reasons. Number one, it's survival horror. You know, you're once again playing as a jobber, as a nobody, right? And weapons and bullets aren't everywhere to be found. The structure of the games have always been, you know, comparable. But in Resident Evil 7, you do feel overwhelmed. You do feel like shit's about to hit the fan at any given moment. And any enemy can kill you based on your current inventory. You know what I mean? Later in the game, you get more shit. But for the majority of the game, you're fucked, right? And that's what's important to note. Resident Evil 8 is similar, not exactly the same, but it's similar to 7 in that sense, where you do feel like you're about to get fucked at every second, right? As a matter of fact, both of these games, the main character is like getting maimed, impaled, cut up, like, you know, all over the place, right? Like, it's fucking insane. I mean, there's like a plot element to it, but the point is, like, this person is fucked, right? So that's what makes this game great. Another thing that makes it very similar to Silent Hill and therefore awesome is that 7 and 8, Resident Evil 7 and 8, both have changed the setting. This is the brilliant storytelling that Capcom has done with Resident Evil historically, right? In the first game, it's a very 90s setting, you know? You're in a fucking mansion. It's like a haunted mansion-y type like vibe, right? But you're fighting zombies. It's very clear that you're fighting humans and other like, you know, mammals basically that have been infected by a parasite of some sort, right? There's monsters and shit, but they're all grounded, right? And they're all explicable. They're all explainable based on the context of the story. Resident Evil 7, well, let's not skip around. Resident Evil 4, that's when things start changing a bit, right? So you play as the same guy from Resident Evil 2, Leon, and now you're in this like weird European country where you're essentially fighting a cult. Now, of course, as I'm sure will be in Resident Evil 8, there's going to be some sort of parasite, some sort of like scientific explanation to this. But the facts are what the facts are. In Resident Evil 4, you don't feel like you're in a sci-fi game. You feel like you're in like some cult, you know, like you versus the cult game. And that's how the game is presented. And there's no qualms about it. It's very clear that you're fighting basically a cult. You know, the fact that the cult might be like involved with parasites is immaterial. You're fighting a cult. The parasite is just there to explain the monsters. The monsters are different. You're fighting like weird shit all the time. So like the setting changes, right? It's an action game, but the setting is much more atmospheric and much more horror driven, right? Same thing with Resident Evil 7, right? Resident Evil 6 and shit like that, that was like a full-blown action game. You're like in a city, you know what I'm saying? Like completely different setting. In these two games, or in Resident Evil 7, you're playing in like basically a house. The majority of the game takes place in a house. And like it's kind of like Resident Evil 1 in the sense where it's like your objective is to like solve this house, if you will, right? But the enemies, there's a few weird enemies, but primarily you're fighting this family who are people, right? So like they're presented, of course there's more to it, but they're presented in many ways as just like a psychotic, like you know, family, right? Like a fucking what's his name? Manson. What the fuck's his first name? Like a Manson-esque family, right? Except they're really a family. So like that's the vibes the game gives you. It doesn't matter if like the next scene some parasite appears, right? Clearly the game is giving you this different horror vibe, like a terror, like a serial killer vibe, right? And it is no different in Resident Evil 8, where the vibe once again completely changes. This fucking game feels like Castlevania, motherfucks. You're going to a castle, you're fighting werewolves off the jump, you know what I'm saying? You're fighting these weird vampiric motherfucks, right? They're not vampires explicitly, at least not yet, but they're like, they have that vampiric like aesthetic, you know what I mean? The game is presented as like a traditional horror, you know, like you're fucked in this town type of game, right? It is completely different and unrecognizable when compared to something like Resident Evil 2 or Resident Evil 6, right? Completely different vibes, right? That's what makes this game fucking amazing. The gameplay, of course, is also solid, right? It's also solid. You have, you know, your standard survival horror mechanics of solve puzzles, find resources, and try to survive, right? But the storyline is so engaging. The pacing is incredible. 10 out of 10 on pacing thus far, motherfucks, right? There's a mystery in there, you know, so there's reasons to keep playing, right? But the primary thing that this game does perfectly, arguably better than every other game of its sort in recent memory, is the atmospheric elements. You feel like you're fucked. You feel like there's no way around it, right? When you play like Resident Evil 1, you know, I think to myself, why don't everyone just point their guns at the door and just shoot a hole through the door? I mean, at a certain point, you'd be able to do it, right? There's more to it than that, of course, but you understand what I'm getting at. In this thing, you're like trapped in a town. Basically, this town has been overrun by evil. Let's just call it that. Overrun by evil. They have their own little mythology and their own little like religion, basically. But this town has been overrun by evil. And you are fucked because you are stuck in this town with no way out, basically, right? You got to find a way out, but good luck doing that, motherfucks. Oh, and there's another quest that you have to do before you get out, but I'm not going to talk about that until ever, probably, motherfucks. So the atmospheric elements of Resident Evil 8, 10 out of 10. The pacing, 10 out of 10. The gameplay, it is what it is. It's what you'd expect. I wouldn't say a 10 out of 10. I'd give it a solid 8, maybe a 9 out of 10, and almost a 10 out of 10 in the context of its genre, right? Like compared to like Silent Hill 1 or 2, the gameplay is like 15,000 times better, obviously, right? Compared to, I don't know, fucking Call of Duty, right? As a first-person shooter, you don't have the same amount of versatility and amount of abilities that you would in Call of Duty. So, but it's not fucking Call of Duty. It's way better, you know what I'm saying? So as far as I'm concerned, motherfucks, the hater is ready to give out his first good review on this channel. We can't give it a 10 out of 10 yet, because then the games that are better than Resident Evil will also be given 10 out of 10s, and we gotta have some sort of standards. So thus far, I'm giving Resident Evil 8 the very coveted A+ award of 9.2, motherfucks. That's an A+ up in this bitch. 10 out of 10 is an S. So A+ award, Resident Evil must play, motherfucks. Must play. That's what I'll be doing all day, as a matter of fact. After I finish this video and maybe get some food, you know, I've worked hard this week to make sure that I would be free today to do whatever the fuck I want. So that's what I'm gonna do. Play some Resident Evil. It's gonna be amazing. So without any further ado, let's conclude this review by saying the following, motherfucks. Go play Resident Evil. Play Silent Hill if you haven't before. You don't need to play Resident Evil 7 to enjoy this. I've learned, thus far at least, I don't know. I played Resident Evil 7 and the connections aren't really there yet. So I think this game can be enjoyed by itself just fine, because it feels like a standalone game. Even though it's a direct sequel with the same characters, it feels like a standalone game, motherfucks. With that being said, take care of yourselves, go buy it. $59.99, motherfucks. PS4, PS5, probably on Xbox as well. Suck it, motherfucks!